Hello, everyone. How you doing? Welcome to Black Intelligence Say Google's Hangout. This is one of our first shows, and the title is Booker T. Washington in Africa: The Making of a Pan-Africanist. And we here with Dr. Wright. How you doing, sister?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good. Um, I would like to ask you, to give your full name, where you was born, and how you get to the point where you start writing a book about Mr. Washington.
Okay, so my name is Tyrene Wright, and I'm a scholar. So I guess that's Tyrene Wright with a PhD. After that, so I'm a researcher and scholar, and I'm originally from New York, and I've lived, on the continent and then back here in the U.S. and I was born and raised here in New York, Brooklyn specifically, and I live in Queens now. And I actually am a Tuskegee alumni. Now, I rarely start an interview out by saying that, but I am a Tuskegee alumni. And maybe that had something to do with me writing the book, but that wasn't the motivation, right? I definitely did learn a lot of things about Washington at Tuskegee that allowed me to have a different perspective of them. But those were things that I learned as a student of history, right? I was a history major there with a concentration in African American history. So I graduated from Tuskegee, go to graduate school in New York City, where I'm from, to University of New York, and then I earned a master's in modern African history with a concentration on independence struggles in Africa, and then I went to Temple University for 2 years, and then I left the United States for a couple of years and taught at the University of Chicago job, briefly returned, and then I got the PhD at Union in Ohio in public policy. And so I combined most of my work, my studies, in terms of, studying how policy impacts African populations. And I do that both internationally and domestically. So this book actually, it's called Booker T. Washington in Africa: The Making of a Pan-Africanist. It really actually falls right there within the realm of the type of work I do, because it's both historical and it also has two policy cases within the book.
So what was the chronology of you getting these degrees and stuff when you sat down and start penning the book?
Oh, so I started writing this book like a year after I finished my PhD. So I finished the PhD in 2011, and I began to write the book in the latter part of 2011, early 2012. I started writing the proposal and drafting the book, and that's a whole, it's a whole other story how I actually end up publishing the book, because which I'm not going to go through the whole story, but the blip is this: I had a publisher, and then I write the book 3 times, and then realize that if I truly understand and believe what I'm writing, not just as a researcher, but as someone who comes from the African experience in the United States, then I also have to put some of this in practice. And I had worked for a publisher for 2 years myself and knew how to publish a book. And I ended up leaving the publishing company I work for and ending my deal and not personal relationship, but my business deal with the publisher I had, and then publishing the book under my own publishing company, which is a whole other story. So it was an interesting journey in terms of how the book actually comes about, but it takes me about 3 writings of the book to get what is the book you have on market right now.
Okay. So let's travel down the road of, page 1. What do this book presents to the people that don't know much about Booker T, Mr. Washington, and his African experience in dealing with policy and people?
Off the top, what the book is basically about is Washington's role in African affairs, his role in Africa, and his relationship with African people on the continent, and what that actually does, right, to him and for him. The book essentially covers the history of early Pan-Africanism and Washington's role in that period, because he definitely had a role in that period in history. But then it moves on to exemplify what he was trying to do, which was produce a model that was viable for African communities. And in doing that, he seeks to export that model. And in exporting this model, he has a lot of contact with budding African nationalists on the continent. And I argue essentially that these interactions transform Booker T. Washington to become what I would consider a Pan-Africanist in a measurable way, because he's involved into policy cases where you're able to measure this level of consciousness or not in light of them. So, for example, the first case is the Liberian crisis, and in the second case, that is the African exclusion measure. In both cases, Washington acts on behalf of African populations, both on the continent and abroad, on the continent of Africa and within the diaspora, right? So the African population scattered in the diaspora, throughout the diaspora. So those are very measurable actions on the part of Washington. And my argument is really essentially that he, as a result of many experiences, he develops into a person who is able to handle those situations and act on behalf of Africans with precision in the case of the African exclusion measure, and in an enduring way in the case of the Liberian crisis, right? So meaning the Liberian crisis spans 5 years. And he endures. He is the person who keeps Liberia on the U.S. agenda to the point of completion in the case. And so, which allows Liberia at that moment in time to exist. And I'll get into the particulars of the case as we talk. But so that's where I'm starting out. Introduction. I'm telling you, giving you an overview. I'm giving you an overview of, what is in the book and how I approach the story of Washington's transformation as a Pan-Africanist.
So what would you say Washington was before he became a Pan-Africanist? What type of title would you say he would have?
Well, that's an interesting question. I've never had that question now, right? But put it this way, he wasn't a Pan-Africanist prior to some major events, but the most important chapter I write in the book is chapter 2, and it is called Booker T. Washington, Pan-Africanism and Pan-Africanist. And in that chapter, I talk about what initially makes him predisposed to being a Pan-Africanist. And those things are, he has a deep love, respect, and admiration for African people, and it's based off of one basic view, and that was his view of his own mother. He believed that a people who could produce someone like his mother must have some good in them that geographers have failed to discover. And so it's his mother who is his motivation for believing, and actually in his reality, knowing that African people are not what is the dominant narrative, right? So that's his first initial reason for digging to understand Africa and African people. And through that, he's in pursuit. He goes on to study on his own time, the history of Africa, trying to put the pieces together. And he does this both through talking to people in his own community, formerly enslaved African persons, and by doing research of his own. And this is over years. Now, all of this information about what makes him fine and predisposed to being a Pan-Africanist is in the book called The Story of the Negro, The Rise of the Race from Slavery. And it's a book that's been written by Washington, and he talks about the history of Africa, his feelings towards Africa, his feelings towards African people, and all of the myths that he's able to dispel in the process of learning about Africa. He also expresses in this book his desire to go to Africa early in his life. So those are some of the things that make him predisposed to becoming a Pan-Africanist, but at that moment in time, he's not. He's just simply somebody who is in pursuit of some level of knowledge and engagement and understanding of Africa and African people, So I don't know what label I would give him. But the labels that people have for him at that point in time, a very American Negro, and this book that I'm discussing is not my book, but the book, The Story of the Negro. It's a book that's written around 1900, 1901 actually, and because it didn't address the social and political dynamics in the United States, it was overlooked. So in other words, Washington writes this book that's all about Africa, but because the budding and the brewing issues and the pressing issues in the United States for the African person was how were we going to move forward.
1 second, sister. Hey, 832, please mute your phone. Please mute your phone. We're getting a little feedback, sir. Go ahead, sister. My bad. I'm sorry.
Okay. So, because the pressing issues were the social and the political rights in the United States and whether or not these should be pushed for, the reviews that came out at that time about the book only criticized it for not having addressed that, but did not address the fact that the book was entirely about African people, Africa itself, Washington's feelings and beliefs about Africans on the continent at home. He refers to Africa as home. And then dealing with myths and beliefs about the African person, the intelligence of African people, the circumstance. And he also gets into a small discussion about his opportunity to get involved in putting Tuskegeans on the ground and running projects and expeditions in Africa. And so I also deal with that in my book in chapter 4, which was very challenging to write, but I deal with the conglomerate of his exploits in Africa. But so this book, The Story of the Negro, was very revealing about how Washington identified himself. He did not identify as a mulatto, okay, but he was aware of the fact that he was the product of an African mother and some stray white man from a neighboring plantation. He's aware of that. He considers them both the unfortunate victims of the institution of enslavement, but he never refers to himself as mixed blood. He never refers to himself as mulatto. And I think those are things that are important if you are asking what did he, how did he view himself, or what could he be considered at that moment in time. If you read the story of the Negro, you know that he largely identified himself as a person of African descent or an African person, in spite of the fact that he knew he was a product of an encounter by an African woman and a non-African, probably Anglo-American man.
Okay, so after this publishing of this book, he took on the two cases that you was referring to earlier.
Well, okay, no, not right away. So in this chapter that I write on Booker T. Washington, Pan-Africanism, Pan-Africanist, I pretty much basically chronicle this whole period where Pan-Africanism is emerging in the world. And the two cases that I'm talking about are years away, 7 to 15 years away. But I position this chapter or this point in the book so you can understand what was happening in the years leading up to 1900, the first Pan-African Conference, and where Washington was in the history. So essentially, you have Henry Sylvester Williams, someone Washington was in personal contact with, reaching out to Washington and initiating a relationship and inviting him to be a part of the plenary session for the first Pan-African Conference. And that communication is extended by Henry Sylvester Williams in 1897. He writes Washington for the first time and asks him to participate in these sessions, and that they basically had established the African Association, and they wanted him to be a part of it, to promote it in the United States, and to be part of this conference that they planned to hold in London in 1900. So they correspond over the years regarding the conference. Washington attends several of the plenary sessions in London for the conference, and he attends some of those sessions along with Du Bois at the time. Washington is asked by Henry Sylvester Williams, who is, by the way, not just a member of the African Association, but he's the secretary of the African Association, out of Trinidad, but based in London. And he asked Washington to first present a paper on lynching. Then, as time goes on, he asked Washington to present a paper on sustainability, which is very interesting because, some people may know Washington was heavily criticized within the United States for not being as vocal as people thought he should be about lynching. And then, of course, sustainability also was right on point, because what Washington is attempting to master, and feels like he has mastered by the time 1900 comes around, is a model, an educational model, and a model that he feels like he can export to Africa through his international students. And so Washington ultimately doesn't give a paper on either at the conference because he doesn't attend the conference. However, he is one of the main promoters of the conference here. Henry Sylvester Williams early on asked him to promote the conference in Washington while still in London after one of these plenary sessions. Begins to write editors of the Black Press, and we know he has significant control of the Black Press. So he begins to write various editors of the Black Press promoting the first Pan-African Conference. And, this is documented in his personal papers, the letters he writes promoting the conference. And in his letters to these editors promoting the conference within the United States, he declares that it is a movement that is about to be set upon its way. and he feels as though it was a significant movement that would be impactful. So he's not under the impression that this first Pan-African conference is going to be just one conference and done. He knows that this unification of African people with the purpose of eradicating oppression is in fact going to be a movement, not just an incident or a moment. And he says so in his correspondence with various editors of Black papers in the United States in his attempt to promote the conference. Right? So once the conference happens, he maintains his relationships, and we know that Du Bois emerges as a very vocal member of the conference, and later on follows up with several congresses, 1919 on, right? But Washington is the person, although he does not attend the conference, who is one, a key promoter of it, two, one of the major members of the plenary sessions, and someone who has the foresight and the vision to see that Pan-Africanism is not going to be a fleeting thing in relationship to African people on the continent or in the diaspora. So that is where he is. He corresponds with various people in Haiti, throughout the Caribbean, on the continent. And so in this same chapter, I actually critique his relationship with key Pan-Africanists of his age, which would be Du Bois and Marcus Garvey.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So who exactly went to the conference for Mr. Washington, seeing that he didn't make it?
No one. He doesn't send his secretary to the conference. He does not send his secretary to the conference. No one goes in his place. Sometimes he was known to send Emmett J. Scott in his place, but he does not send Emmett J. Scott in his place in this instance, right? So he doesn't attend. But he remains in touch with Henry Sylvester Williams. This is the thing about this is important. The thing about this that is important is before we have Pan-Africanism coined by Henry Sylvester Williams, we know that Pan-Africanism existed amongst African people, right? So it's our attempt to unify in the face of oppression, or with the purpose of eradicating oppression. That's a very basic working definition of Pan-Africanism, right? And that's with all the other extra stripped away. So we know that he is a part of this history, right? See, there is nobody before that considered Pan-Africanist.
Hold up, excuse me, sister. Hey, y'all need to mute your phones when you come in. If you're listening live on YouTube, you're welcome to call in at 312-985-7856, but you must mute your phone line when you come in, so you won't interrupt the sister when she's speaking. Thank everyone for doing so. Okay, you got the floor again, sister.
Okay, so Pan-Africanism is new and budding in the world, right? It's very new, 1900s, the first conference. So Washington is on the right side of history with respect to Pan-Africanism in terms of being a part of the plenary sessions and helping to promote it and believing in the vision that it would be, trying to contribute to that in every way during that time. And he's diligent. I mean, there's quite a bit of correspondence between he and Henry Sylvester Williams that you can see in the book. But what happens is that Pan-Africanism goes beyond just this conference. There are contacts in, Haiti and in the Caribbean, throughout the Caribbean, that people he's corresponding with. Right? He's corresponding with people on the African continent. And I get into that in chapter 4, all the African nationalists that he is communicating with and how that influences him. But in chapter 2, I go on to look at his relationship with two key Pan-Africanists, which were Garvey and Du Bois. And it's not coincidental that he has a relationship with both. What I wanted to do with Du Bois is this, deal with Du Bois up front, because I know that that's the controversial part, the relationship between the two. But also, too, I wanted to bring, just the truth to the situation. That so many people look at that relationship and choose to talk about what the public conversation and discourse was between the two. But the reality is that their private relationship was very different than their public relationship. And that relationship is initiated by Du Bois in 1894. And the information I present in the book around Washington and Du Bois' relationship really deflates this idea that they had this epic conflict. It's not true. It's not true. There was a problem between the two, and I will get into that, but it's not what most people believe the problem was, okay? And Du Bois talks about that later in life, but the problem is that, we rarely go to the primary sources on this stuff, so we believe, secondary stories and, conversations about that conflict. So here it goes. This is the story. Du Bois initiates the relationship with Washington in 1894 by way of a letter that he writes to him. The reason Du Bois initiates the relationship is because he's a graduate of Fisk, and he had recently graduated from Harvard and spent 2 years abroad, and now he was back, and he was looking for a job. And so he writes to Booker T. Washington that he knows his wife, which is in fact true. Margaret Murray Washington and Du Bois both attended Fisk, and they were acquaintances. So this is how he comes to know of Washington personally. That's his 1 degree of separation. And so he writes him, and actually this documentation, this correspondence is actually in the book. The book is footnoted. I changed it to footnotes so that people could follow along and follow via the Booker T. Washington papers, which are the personal papers, and see the actual documents that I'm talking about in, each and every chapter or on each and every page. So the first letter Du Bois writes to Washington says this. It says, President Washington, sir, may I ask if you have a vacancy for a teacher in your institution next year? I am a Fisk and Harvard man and have just returned from 2 years abroad as a scholar of the John F. Slater trustees. My specialty is history and social science, but I can teach German, philosophy, natural science, classics. Your wife knows of me, and I refer by permission to President Gilman of Johns Hopkins University. And Du Bois wrote that to Washington right after he graduated, and that was in July of 1894 when he comes back to the United States. Washington responds favorably, offers him a position, but before Du Bois gets that offer, he accepts the position at Wilberforce, I believe. And so he does not come to Tuskegee out on that occasion. Now they remain in contact, and they have a mentor-mentee relationship from then on out. And they discuss, employment situations that Du Bois is having and intentions and plans for future research. And so the following, maybe a couple of years later, Du Bois in 1896 actually writes Washington again, and he lays out more clearly what he plans to do at Tuskegee if he were to work there. And so he writes this to him: "Dear Mr. Washington, I feel that I should like to work at Tuskegee if I could be of service to you. My idea has been that there might gradually be developed there a school of Negro history and social investigation, which might serve to help place more and more the Negro problem on a basis of sober facts. I think that in time, various colleges like Harvard, Chicago, Johns Hopkins, and the U of Penn would join in supporting such a movement. What do you think? At the present, I know just how I could be of service. I can teach most primary and secondary branches, preferring, of course, history, economics, social problems. I have had an indication that I may possibly expect an offer from the University of Pennsylvania for a year, after which, if needed, I could come to Tuskegee, perhaps have the active aid of a great college like the University of Penn. In any case, I am willing and eager to entertain any position for giving my services to your school." So that was one of the other letters in the book. It shows that Du Bois was intending to come and teach at Tuskegee. That happened in the summer of 1903, we believe, although I have not been able to find a syllabus. We know for a fact that Du Bois spent the summer of 1903 in Tuskegee at Washington's house. And that, yes, is, of course, the same summer that, not the same summer, but the same year that The Souls of Black Folks was published, right? Now, what happens between them is this. That summer of 1903, there was also the Boston riot. And Du Bois, after spending the summer in Tuskegee, at some point he went to visit Monroe Trotter. And he congratulates Trotter on his handling of the riots, but not on the riots itself, right? He did not encourage the riots. Washington, who was, I guess you could say, the arch enemy of someone like Trotter. Trotter opposed Washington very aggressively in the press and was one of his major critics. Washington saw Du Bois coalescing with Trotter as an affront. And that is his grievance with Du Bois, okay? But neither talk about that in the public realm. Du Bois' issue with Washington, which probably goes a little bit deeper because it comes from a sense of rejection in a way. Washington had something at his disposal called the Tuskegee Machine. And the Tuskegee Machine was a network of people, primarily power brokers, all of which who did the bidding of Booker T. Washington, both black and white. And Du Bois had a problem with this because part of what the Tuskegee Machine did was reward and or punish black people on occasion. And so Washington had that level of power. Du Bois saw and felt that he used this power to silence the young African so-called American leadership in the United States that did not agree with him. Now, what I would say as a researcher, I would say that Washington absolutely both used and abused the Tuskegee Machine and his power. And so, yes, he was intolerant of young black leadership that did not go along with his program. And that was Du Bois' chief grievance with Washington. It is what all of his feelings and behavior thereafter are based on, not the programmatic difference. Because Du Bois knew better than anyone, as someone who attempted to teach at Tuskegee on several occasions, he knew better than anyone that history and pedagogy and the social sciences were also taught at Tuskegee from its inception. Tuskegee was a school for teachers. not simply a vocational and industrial or vocational school. The charter in 1893, when the school is established as independent, establishes that it is in fact a school for teachers who can teach the academics and to industry. And so it's never been an industrial school. It has never been, when it was initiated, it wasn't solely an industrial school. It was a normal school. And when Washington makes school independent, which we can talk about that later when we get into the institutional history, when Washington makes the school independent in 1893, the charter absolutely says it's a school for teachers. And so it has always been a school that produced more college-educated Black people than manual laborers. Okay? It always had a covert educational program, primarily because of the history and the positioning, of the institution. It's so deep in the South. So, it proclaimed or seemed as though it was an industrial and vocational school, but in actuality, the documentation, the legal existence of the institution has always been defined as a school for teachers. So Du Bois knew this. He always knew this. He always knew that the curriculum had a space for historians, taught history, and Du Bois, make no mistake about it, is a historian first, right? His PhD is in history.
Yes.
So that later on, Du Bois discusses his relationship to Washington in a more honest way in an essay called My Personal Relations with Booker T. Washington and Others. See, in the Souls of Black Folk, he admits that he put that book together somewhat at the last minute, and that it was fugitive chapters from various pieces that he had written previously. And to those fugitive pieces, as he calls them, he adds this chapter on Mr. Booker T. Washington. Now, that is the critique of vocational and industrial education versus the social sciences and liberal arts. However, Du Bois is aware at the time that that is not his chief issue with Washington. However, he is unwilling to have the personal conversation in the public realm, so that is his chief debate in the public realm against Washington, and that would be the programmatic difference that people go on and give life to, and write many things about, in the larger American narrative. But that is not his real grievance with Washington. In My Personal Relations with Booker T. Washington and Others, Du Bois admits what I stated, which was that his chief issue was not programmatic difference, but Washington's use and abuse of the Tuskegee machine. They actually could have always been aligned, and Du Bois really understood that later in life. In 1963, before he dies, he writes in The Crisis that there wasn't that much difference between the two of them. But one way we can see this is that before Washington dies, they are actually aligned with each other. And that alliance you can see in the last chapter of the book, because they being Booker T. Washington, Monroe Trotter, and Du Bois, they are all aligned against the African exclusion measure. But it is Washington who is able to have the most impact on the demise of that amendment that was attached to the larger immigration bill of 1915. But Du Bois and Monroe Trotter were not there with him physically or in his efforts, but they were aligned against this measure.
When you say in the book, are you talking about your book, to be precise?
Yes, in my book.
Okay.
Yes, in my book. In in my book, the last chapter of the book, it's the case of the African exclusion measure. And that's a case where the U.S. government attempted to lock all African and Black people out of the United States via the larger immigration bill of 1915. And the measure actually is passed in the Senate and goes to the House. And in the effort to fight against this measure, Washington, Du Bois, and Monroe Charter are all on the same side. However, Washington is the only one of the three who has the power to influence what the outcome will be, right? And mount the greatest and most effective opposition to the measure. And he does that in various ways. So they are aligned, and they're aware that they're aligned against the measure, right? There's correspondence. Everything in the book, let me say this, everything in the book is corroborated with, it's actually not even corroborated. Everything in the book is produced as a result of Washington's personal correspondence with any number of these individuals. So basically, this is how I produced the book. I had hints about a lot of different things, and I can get into that, but I had hints about a lot of different things. And so what I do is I go into this massive collection called the Booker T. Washington Papers, and I go through all of the correspondence related to Africa, African people, all of these various Pan-Africanists, and I begin to list all of that and construct the cases, right? So it's very tedious work because you're putting together literally correspondence to and from various people. But when you think about it, at that time, that's how people communicated when they weren't in the same place, right? It's like email, but you have the actual documents. And so, or the edited versions. This is also in the, in the volume. So you can get it in book form, or you can actually see the collection at one point in time online or at various archives. So you pull each letter, gives you a wealth of information. And I follow all of this information and construct the cases. So I can see what Washington is saying to members of his Tuskegee machine, the secret network in this case. I can see that he's saying to them, go to D.C. and pull every string possible to defeat this unjust bill. I can see how they hold up the Congress, hold the Congress by sending individuals in there who are there for the primary purpose of holding up this measure until they understand who they need to lobby and who is voting in what way, right? So all of that is evident in Washington's personal papers. The problem has been over the years is that people don't exactly know who all these individuals are. Nobody's into doing this tedious type of historical work. But what emerges are some very interesting scenarios and stories. And so in that case, there is a ferocious debate on the floor of the House around the desire or this measure that will lock out the African population. By the way, the African population they're talking about is not simply the African population from Africa. It's really targeting African population from the Caribbean, Central, and South America, who were the labor force on the Panama Canal. And at the point of completion of the Panama Canal, a senator out of Missouri proposes that they are locked out, this African population, who actually receive U.S. wages working on constructing the canal. So they want to say to this population, thank you for your labor, but no thanks on immigration. And Washington, without having to be schooled on the fact that these African people in the Caribbean were in fact African, he responds accordingly and propagandizes in the press first, and then simultaneously through the Tuskegee machine. And he had a remedy even if that didn't work. to basically say that, he doesn't care how racist Woodrow Wilson was, but if this measure passed, he would go to him himself and demand that this measure that's attached to the bill be vetoed. So he was relentless. What he was trying to protect was the steady stream of students that he had coming from the African continent first, because he was most interested in that. But then he also was interested in the flow of students, African students from around the world, because it was part of his mission. He believed that what he was doing at Tuskegee was that he had created a model, perfected even, a model of sustainability that was applicable to African communities around the world. And his international students were his primary means of exporting this model. And so he wasn't going to allow the American government to interrupt that. That was something he was very committed to. He had passed up his opportunity to go to Africa and work himself. And it is a desire of him. He always dreamed of that. So his involvement in Africa wasn't arbitrary. He always wanted to be involved with Africa. Okay? And so he cannot do that. And so he lives vicariously through his students. And with his international students, he makes them pretty much promise to return, because he feels that the mission is incomplete if they do not return to their communities and apply what they learned in regard to the Tuskegee methods and model.
Which is very, very intelligent, because then that breaks down the language barrier. He don't need to teach anyone a new language. They already know the language of the native people and native tongue.
Right. And so that's what he was actually doing. Now, the thing about it is that some people have actually criticized the book, because I do talk about the fact that some people did notice that Washington was up to something very effective at Tuskegee. Both Black people and white people might have known that, but because Washington had this image as the accommodationist, as somebody who was willing to forego political and social rights, he had the perfect mask, to be quite honest, to conduct some of this work, right? Because he could do it without an enormous amount of suspicion. It almost seemed as though they had completely accepted him as an accommodationist and didn't even look into the things he did or said. To be quite frank with you, I was always shocked and surprised, because so much of what he said on paper could have gotten him killed or would get any one of us killed, to be quite frank with you, today. Okay. So the fact that he was able to do that and people go undetected was very, very interesting, but it had everything to do with his public image or persona. And so not everyone was fooled. Okay. Some people would just look at what he was doing and found that very provocative. And one of those people that called him out, so to speak, in the way we would say it, was Thomas Dixon. Thomas Dixon was a Southern white racist, but most Americans were racist at that time. But he was a Southern white person who had authored a book called The Klansman, which inspired a film called The Birth of a Nation, which incited whites in this country and caused a resurgence of the Klan. And this is during our nadir, right? Our nadir is 1895 to 1915, which means our lowest point. And it would be considered our lowest point after enslavement. Our first point, but our lowest point, because we found that there was enormous backlash for Black progress in this country at that moment in time. And that's a whole nother story. But the point is, it is our nadir. And Thomas Dixon and others are having this, white supremacist fervor sweep the nation, right? Birth of a Nation was a major film in this country.
Yes,
and
it
they
was.
came out in droves, and it really addressed, not only did it address or give credence to some of the white fears and feelings about Black people, it also, for those who didn't feel that way, it gave a visual to them, right? So Thomas Dixon was someone who critiqued and criticized Washington a lot, and he had the nerve to write in a paper, which was the Saturday Evening Post of Philadelphia. He wrote in 1905 about Tuskegee, and he called the article Booker T. Washington and the Negroes, Some Dangerous Aspects of the Work of Tuskegee. And he writes in that paper that, and I quoted in my book at the beginning of chapter 3, he writes in that paper, Mr. Washington is not training Negroes to take their place in any industrial system of the South in which the white man directs or controls him. He is not training his students to be servants and come at the beck and call of any man. He is training them all to be masters of men, to be independent, to own and operate their own industries, to plant their own fields, buy and sell their own goods, and in every shape and form, destroy the last vestige of dependence on the white man for anything. Every pupil who passes through Mr. Washington's hands cease forever to work under a white man. Not only so, he goes forth trained as an evangelist to preach the doctrine of separation and independence. And so, you know, Dixon writes this about Washington and the Tuskegee model, and then my job as a researcher is to say, is this in fact true? What are they doing at Tuskegee? And regardless of who Dixon is, we can see that Tuskegeans are being taught to own and operate. They are being taught to not simply make a wheel, but to make a carriage. There was a programmatic aversion at Tuskegee for producing simply raw goods or unfinished products. So students were graded along those lines. So you couldn't produce a wheel. You had to produce a carriage, right? Tuskegee Red Clay produced bricks, but the students were erecting buildings. You can see this in my book, actually, in chapter 3. I break down the entire institution, everything they were doing. It's even in the culture. There's a Tuskegee saying for students who are getting ready to attend the institute that said, leave your underwear at home, we make our own at Tuskegee. Because the concept was that all the human necessities of man, woman, and child was something that we could produce ourselves. And that, in actuality, is real Black power. When you need no one because you can feed yourself, you can house yourself. So Tuskegeans are just creating bricks. They're erecting buildings. They're not just building carriages. They're not just building wheels, making wheels. They're building carriages. They're not just producing the soles of a shoe. They're producing the whole shoe. You understand? They're producing their own food, and that's where Carver comes in, because he basically teaches subsistence farming, not just to Tuskegee agricultural students, but to Macon County residents in rural part of Macon County. And they have a Tuskegee School on Wheels that went out to rural parts of Macon County and taught farmers how to plant crops that replenish the soil instead of depleted it, and then produce crops that they could actually, basically subsistence farming, produce enough for themselves and for the market. And so that was, Thomas Dixon is just another voice in the chorus of voices that criticize Washington. But if we can't find any truth in what he says, then we must throw it away. But there is some truth in what he's saying about Tuskegee. There is some truth in the sense that what is happening at Tuskegee are nation management practices that Washington is very interested in exporting. But he wasn't the only one to notice that about Tuskegee as well.
So Booker T. Washington was our first spook by the door, if you know the movie I'm referring to.
Right. He was better than the spook because he would be the spook temporarily, and then the spook would go back home and share everything he got from the big house, with the people.
So,
so he certainly wore a mask in American society, but he was committed to African people. Right.
So at the same time, he was bringing about, as he said, a heaven right here on earth and not waiting on heaven to come.
Essentially, I mean, if heaven is being able to control your own destiny in your life, then yeah, he believed in hard work. He believed in commitment. He believed that he wanted the students to have a commitment to the mission. Tuskegee, principles talk about head, hand, and heart. And so in addition to having intellect and know-how, ability to put things in practice, right hand, he felt that you had to be committed in the heart. And so he gave lectures on character building every Sunday at the chapel on campus. And those were, you could actually see what those lectures were to the student body and faculty in the book called Character Building. And there's actually an audio version of it on YouTube or whatever called Character Building, which is, the name of the book. So it was there was a combined mission. Because the institution was sustainable, there were a lot of students who came there without the money to pay. And so in addition to being able to maintain the academics and everything else, he wanted that commitment that not only were international students going to go back to their homeland and their communities and implement Tuskegee methods and practices, even the student born within the U.S. had to be committed to going back to their community and, establishing themselves and building, right? As well.
So this is truly Pan-Africanism if he's allowing foreigners or Africans throughout the diaspora to come to Tuskegee and learn his method and model and take it back and show the effect, the how effective it is on African soil and on other land masses throughout the diaspora.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So would you bless us with a little bit of the Liberian situation?
Oh yes, okay, sure. Let me say one other thing about the Tuskegee model, and that's a very interesting chapter as well, because I talk about who is the real founder of Tuskegee, which was in Washington. Washington, I call him the builder and the father of Tuskegee, in the sense that he raised and cultivated Tuskegee, right? And he reestablishes it as independent. But there's a brief story. There's two things that I want to go back to before I go to Liberia.
Most definitely.
One is this brief story of the founding of Tuskegee, and then the other is Garvey, which once we discussed Du Bois, I kind of skipped over, and that's in chapter 2, the story that is Marcus Garvey and his relationship, which is very important, his relationship with Booker T. Washington. But first, Tuskegee is an institution that was founded by its people. And that's a significant difference between it and many other historically Black institutions. There was a man by the name of Lewis Adams, who was a formerly enslaved person, who had organized Tuskegeans to vote for an incumbent Alabama senator named Foster. And you have to understand that this was during shortly after radical Reconstruction time. And Tuskegeans were politically astute and organized in Macon County. And so Lewis Adams successfully organizes the Black vote of Tuskegee. Foster is reelected. And he saw this as a political favor, and he comes back to Lewis Adams and asks him, "What would you like?" And Lewis Adams is the person who says, he could have said, "I want a team of, cattle or whatever people do to plow their land," or, or I want a plot of land, or I want the Model T when it comes out. He could have said anything. He could have asked for something for himself. He did not. He asked for one simple thing. He said he wanted a school for his people. And that was the birth of Tuskegee, the Negro Normal School at Tuskegee. Lewis Adams saying, I want a school for my people. And we have to understand, he wasn't even 20 years out of enslavement. This may have well as been the next day, may as well have been the next day out of enslavement. But he had that vision to say, I want a school for my people. And that was the birth of Tuskegee. It was housed in a one-room church, the AME Church in Tuskegee. So Washington comes there shortly after, and he is the person who builds the institute to what we know it to be. But in 1893, true to form, Washington is the person who also does something just as important as what Lewis Adams did, and that was he decided to make the institution independent from the state of Alabama. And so he buys the institution and he creates its own charter, right? He makes it independent from the state of Alabama. So Tuskegee to this day has a very peculiar status. It's called quasi-private. It is private, but state affiliated. So it owns itself and it has a board of trustees. So it essentially it's owned by the people, right? So that's how it's created, the nonprofit organization. So Lewis Adams is very important. It shows us, I always make sure to tell that story whenever I talk about Tuskegee, because it's not just about Tuskegee. It tells you what the values of African people are at that moment in time, in that small place. And you had people who understood the value of education for our people, and not simply vocational education, because even then, the Negro Normal School at Tuskegee is a school for teachers, right? So that is the true story. But Washington gets all the credit and the glory because he is, in fact, the father and the builder of the institute and brings it to what it becomes, later on, and makes many personal sacrifices to do that. He loses 2 wives, he buries 2 wives in the process. There's a lot of personal hardships that he suffers that, we don't really get a feel for in the larger American narrative, right? So.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And then I'll go back to Garvey, but if you guys, I don't know if there's people who want to comment on that or.
Yeah, I think from my studies, Garvey had a little bit to do with Liberia too, right? At one point in time.
I'm not so sure about that. I've been questioned about that very often. I know Garvey had his newspaper in every port in West Africa that he could. And so he always had this international feel and a presence in Africa, right? So I'll go more into that when I do. Do you want me to go right into Marcus Garvey because he is?
Nah. I mean, you can stay with your flow. I'm loving the flow and stuff. I don't really want to.
Well, that was the next thing I was going to go into, Marcus Garvey.
Okay, I really don't want to. I don't want to knock you off your flow. It's sounding good, and you making some points that I believe a lot of people will appreciate. So go ahead.
Okay. So part of what I didn't discuss in chapter 2 right now, but it's in the book, is the other significant Pan-Africanist during that period, and that is Marcus Garvey. Now we know Marcus Garvey is from Jamaica, St. Anne's Bay, Jamaica, and Marcus Garvey is in touch with various people throughout the world. He's very much connected with this budding Pan-Africanist world that Washington is also in touch with. And I'll get more into that, why I say that, and who Washington is corresponding with, because that also is, I dedicated an entire chapter to who Washington is talking to and the African nationalist, the Pan-Africanist he is dealing with continent and responsible for what I consider his transformation, right? But Marcus Garvey is someone who read Booker T. Washington's book From Slavery, and in his own words, he was inspired by it. He wanted to structure the UNIA after the Tuskegee model, because he definitely recognized that Tuskegee was all about a model of self-sufficiency. So he basically, he reaches out to Booker T. Washington following a conference that was held at Tuskegee by Washington. And that conference was held in 1912. It was called the International Conference on the Negro. And that conference was Washington's Pan-African Conference, so to speak. It's held in Tuskegee, and various people from the continent, the Caribbean, Central and South America actually come, but the focus of the conference is on Africa. And there are some colonial administrators who also come to Tuskegee to this conference. Various people like Casely Hayford, I believe, actually attempt to attend this conference, but people like this Muhammad Ali, who is also in touch with Washington, talk about this kind of conference internationally. So the conference takes place, and at the conference there are 8 Jamaican educators who come from Jamaica to engage at Tuskegee and see this model. Tuskegee was used to putting on a display of their industry and what was happening at Tuskegee. And so they did basically have all of this on display. Every industry that existed there, the delegates could go through and see what they were doing in terms of, agriculture, what they were doing in terms of architecture, what they were doing in terms of the business, right? What they were doing in shops in terms of producing clothes or anything like that, or in animal science. So all these shops, basically the campus was on display, right, for its practices and sustainable model. These 8 Jamaican educators go back to Jamaica and explain that there was a resolution at this conference at Tuskegee to erect a Tuskegee-like institute in Jamaica. They give all the information that they acquire at this conference to Du Bois. They share this information, not Du Bois, they share this information with Garvey when they return to Jamaica. It is at that point that Garvey begins to correspond with Booker T. Washington. He writes him, and that correspondence, his initial correspondence and his correspondence back and forth over the years, is detailed in my book in this chapter as well, chapter 2. And you can see the intimate correspondence between the two men, much of which revolved around the attacks that Garvey was receiving by other African people who were also in Jamaica, who did not believe in the mission and the purpose of the UNIA. Garvey, writes to Washington that he knows that he has his critics, but on each and every letter, let me go back. Garvey writes to Washington that Washington can understand having a chorus of critics because, he faces that in the U.S. by Trotter and others, and Garvey is aware of that, right? The attacks on Washington and the public narrative and conversation going on between various intellectuals and leadership in the United States and Washington. So Garvey is aware of that, and that is really kind of like the basis upon which they strike up a relationship. So there's consistent correspondence between the two. Washington is the person who invites Garvey to the United States to see Tuskegee. But Garvey also writes at the end of almost every letter that he is Washington's faithful and humble servant. So he identifies with him both in practice, in theory, and in practice. Ideologically, he identifies with him, and in practice, in terms of what the practices are at Tuskegee, he identifies with them. The UNIA is a replica of Tuskegee. So Garvey is able to come to the United States in March of 1916. However, as we know, this case in the book, the last case in the book, the African Exclusion Measure, was a targeted Garvey population, the African population of the Caribbean, Central, and South America. Had Washington failed to defeat that measure, or had that measure passed, right, as part of the larger immigration bill in 1915, January 1915, Garvey could not have come into the United States the following year, in March of 1916. Now, this is the irony of it all. Garvey, the African exclusion measure is defeated in January 1915. Washington died in November of 1915, and Garvey arrived in the U.S. in March of 1916, 4 months after Washington's death. And of course, as planned, his first stop on his trip was to Tuskegee to see the model that it was. So the existence, the inspiration, the existence of a Marcus Garvey in the United States is on many levels a result of Booker T. Washington. Conceptually, he is inspired by Washington's story. In practice, he models UNIA after it, right? Because it's supposed to be sustainable. And his very presence in the United States has everything to do with the defeat of a measure that would have kept Garvey and other African people out of the United States after January of 1915, right? So the demographic of our communities right now would look different had the African exclusion measure passed. There would be no Africans or Black people from anywhere else on the planet here in the United States, except for those that had been brought here by enslavement or those who got here somehow before 1915. So that, in effect, is how Washington impacts our, immediate community with the defeat of that measure. And so Garvey is the product of that, right? He comes here 4 months after Washington dies, but a year and 2 months after that measure is defeated. And so they maintain a relationship, obviously, until the time of Washington's death. And they correspond directly between each other, the two. So once Garvey comes here, later on you see him in conflict with Du Bois, but that was not his initial posture, So I critique both the relationship with Washington and the relationship with Du Bois at the end of chapter 2, and I essentially assess the fact that, Du Bois, who he becomes as a Pan-Africanist, has nothing to do with Washington. He would go on to establish the Pan-African Congresses, of which, he would start in 1919. But all of the members, and this is something that is important for us to understand, all of the members of the first Pan-African Conference in 1900 are dead by the time the first Pan-African Congress takes place in 1919. And Washington is one of those people who would be deceased by that time. So Du Bois is truly a sole survivor. He is quite young at that time, but he's a sole survivor in that instance. And he goes on to lead the conferences that bring about a certain level of consciousness amongst African leadership on the continent. And that is separate from the history he has from Washington. Washington developed in a different way as a Pan-Africanist. He develops more by being behind the scenes and having these relationships with various Pan-Africanists and facilitating the mission. But he would, not be dependent, or his role in Pan-Africanism and the history of it is not dependent on Du Bois, because this is a concept and a practice that's just becoming defined, right, in the world at that moment in time, primarily by Africans who are outside of Africa. And then Garvey, of course. Yes, Garvey is truly a product of Washington's philosophy, Washington's efforts, and Washington's really ability and measure of power here, right, with heavy influence in the African exclusion measure, allowing Garvey to come here. So, that's Washington's relationship to those major Pan-Africanists at that moment in time. But we can place them in the history, and they're behind the scenes. So when people are saying, Washington can't be any Pan-Africanist, like, what are you talking about? He was right there in the middle of the history. He was central in some of the history of early Pan-Africanism, right? The first time people are saying Pan-Africanism in that way, in that phrase coined by Henry Podesta Williams, Washington is there. So, but this history is there. This history is something that's accessible. I think the larger, and I talk about it in the preface, the larger American narrative has been monopolized by one person or two people in particular, in terms of the history of Washington. And so you don't get this information, right? Because there are a particular number of people who have been the ones to, write the biographies on Washington. And those individuals are white, not black. And I talk about that in the preface, what's the work that we must be committed to doing in terms of our leadership, right?
Okay.
So I'll stop there if there's any comments or questions, and then I'll go on to Liberia.
Nah, we're not dealing with the audience right now. We're gonna leave Q&A for after the Liberia conversation.
Okay.
But it's very interesting the things that you bringing out, because when I search YouTube and I search out here, I read some of them letters where you quoted what Garvey said at the end of the letters. Some brothers actually pointed these things out to me, and they talk pretty good about this. But you bringing out things that I haven't heard yet, so I'm interested in hearing this next part. And then after that, people, you can call in 312-985-7856 for the Q&A. If you call in anytime before that, please mute your phones so you won't disturb the conversation. So if you could just wait until she get through with this portion, then you could call in and we'll have Q&A, and you can kind of leave your mics open long as you're not in the, real harsh sounding area. But with that said, sister, you got the floor again. Let's hear about Liberia, because, I done heard a little bit of this conversation, and I want the people to hear it because it was very interesting when I heard it.
Okay. So, Liberia, the Liberian crisis is something that began in 1907 and would go from 1907 to 1912. Now, Liberia had been in crisis on many occasions. The problem with Liberia was this, that once the African population that was resettled in Liberia is there and attempting to establish itself, which was done by, the American Colonization Society in 1847, there's always been conflict between this Americo-Liberian population, which is the formerly enslaved African person, and the indigenous Liberian, who is the African person in that region that was never displaced or enslaved in the United States, right? And the indigenous Liberian is comprised of indigenous Liberians are comprised of many ethnic groups, right, that have never been displaced or removed. So in 1907, there were conflicts on the ground between these two groups, but there was another issue going on, which was that the French, the British, and the German colonial forces on the ground were trying to annex portions of Liberia. Generally, you could say, and the larger picture was that these colonial and these imperial forces in Africa were generally intolerant of an independent African nation in this region. They wanted the U.S. to state its claim to Liberia in a colonial fashion, right? But the U.S., adhering to what may have been the Monroe Doctrine, was unwilling to state claim to Liberia. So basically, they had not taken territory in Africa. But what the U.S. government does do is, in Navy ships off the coast of Liberia, they come into Liberia and consistently put down conflict between Americo-Liberians and the indigenous Liberian population and nation on the ground. So on this occasion, where the French, British, and the German imperial forces on the ground are attempting to annex Liberia, a Liberian official writes Booker T. Washington. And he asked for Washington to essentially intercede, to get involved. And they chose him strategically. They chose him because they felt like, because he was an accommodationist in the American context, that he would be a person that, if aligned with the survival of Liberia, would be the best person to lobby the United States government in order for them to protect Liberia from these imperial forces on the ground, from annexing the nation. Now, at this point in time, Washington is very, very, very aware of the fact that Liberia is one of only two independent African countries on the continent. He is, at this moment, I would say, someone who is, he is a Pan-Africanist at this moment in time, and still developing, but he's having experiences behind the scenes, which I'll talk about after this, that are educating him about what's happening on the ground in Africa, right? And I don't want to be mysterious. He's communicating with people who inform him of intimate experiences and incidents going on the continent. So it's through those experiences that he comes to have a deep understanding, that as opposed to a casual understanding of what's happening on the ground in Africa and various nations on the African continent. So in Liberia, he responds to this, asks for help, and at the time he is one of Theodore Roosevelt's key advisors with regard to African people, Black people, which I consider African people in America, and African people abroad, So he is the key advisor to Theodore Roosevelt, on these matters. He goes to Roosevelt. He gets a quick response from Roosevelt to essentially assist in this crisis in Liberia. What's also happening on the ground in Liberia is that each colonial force is threatening to imitate the other on opposite borders. So obviously, if the French are saying if the British take this much land on this side, the southern side, we are going to annex the same amount of land on the northern side. So basically attempting to annex territory on all of Liberia's borders, with the exception of the coast, right? Washington gets a quick response from Theodore Roosevelt to help and assist, and and to assist very quickly. Washington then begins to communicate with the Liberian Commission in Liberia, which are a series of Liberian officials, and they put together a delegation so that these men can come together and come to the United States and meet with Roosevelt and ask for what they need for Liberia, as opposed to going through the State Department. Okay. When the Liberian Commission comes to the U.S., Roosevelt, and now let me say this once again. I have to make sure that I say this. I know all of this. Why? Because of intimate communication. All of this, literally, blow for blow, is in the book, and it's all, documented correspondence. So at the end of every page, you can see, the letters, right? So you can see where you find letter XYZ that corresponds to this. So this is why I know what they're saying to each other, when, how, and why, right? So Washington invites the Liberian Commission to the U.S. And that is comprised of several people. By the way, that's the picture that's on the cover of the book. But it is comprised of the former president of Liberia, former vice president of Liberia, a U.S. representative to Liberia also. Well, let me actually give you some specific information. So, Secretary of Liberia Commission is there. You wouldn't know who their names are, but, then there's also the former president of Liberia, former vice president of Liberia, Washington's executive secretary. But that's the picture in the shadows on the book. That's who that is, the Liberian Commission hosted in Tuskegee. And I'll explain how that happened. So this commission, those men are invited to the U.S. Washington is very excited because in spite of the fact that, Liberia is in a bad way, he's excited because he understands who Liberians are. They are us, So this has never happened before. He's excited. He wants to do all kinds of pomp and circumstance for them. And Roosevelt, in the correspondence, says no. Liberia's in a bad way. It's in a bad situation. There'll be no pomp and circumstance for them, right? We were just going to have them here and we'll do, whatever you want to do, but we're not doing any pomp and circumstance for them. Washington could care less about that, and he believes there should be, so he invites the commission down to Tuskegee, and he hosts them there for several days. He takes them all over the place, has various meetings with them. And then what he does is, in classic form, he orchestrates and plans several meetings for the commission with President Roosevelt at the White House. And these meetings are secret meetings that are held in the evening at the White House. So they leave Tuskegee after having, several days in Tuskegee hosted by Washington. And they go back to D.C. Washington accompanies them, and basically they get to sit with Roosevelt and Taft and the Secretary of State, Elihu Root, and ask for exactly what they want. Now, why does Washington do this? Washington is concerned about one thing and one thing only. He wants to protect and ensure the survival of Liberia. He doesn't want them to go through the State Department. So he brings them there, and they directly ask the State Department official, right, the head of the State Department, for what they want. They're able to do that, but Washington is concerned about one major thing, aside from protecting the survival of Liberia. He believes that this change in administration that is about to happen, because Roosevelt is on his way out of office, Taft is coming in. He has both of them there, and the reason why he has them both there is because he feels that the change of administration will undermine any agreement made with Roosevelt that Taft has to carry out. So he brings these men there together so that he can ensure that even with the transfer of power in the United States, it will not derail what is put in place for Liberia. He's ruthless, to be quite frank. I know some people wouldn't consider that ruthless, but his objective is something that you can see in the correspondence. He is going to do whatever it takes. Do you understand? Meaning he's thinking of everything. He's truly a chess player, not a checkers player, because he's thinking several steps ahead. Like, what could derail the support I get for Liberia? Who could derail the support I get for Liberia? And when he realizes what those things are and who those people might be, he brings them together in order to decrease the possibility of anyone, not following through on whatever the agreement is. And so all goes well. The Liberian Commission goes back to the U.S., and the U.S. decides they want to send a commission. There's a lot of controversy around this commission. It even ends up in the New York Times, an article about it. And basically, it's along the lines of the fact that the members of the commission, some of which were chosen by Washington, but many that were chosen by President Roosevelt. The members of the commission are primarily white men, and the whatever number is supposed to be Washington. He's supposed to accompany, but he would not leave Tuskegee, so he sends Emmett J. Scott to get to Liberia instead. When this happens, there's fanfare around the commission because the members of the commission were white men who were, in fact, thorough racists, some of them, and refused to ride to Liberia on a boat with a black man. So each of the members of the commission sailed to Liberia from the U.S. in the order in which they are on the commission, but in separate vessels. And it makes the New York Times. So all of them go, including Emmett J. Scott, to Liberia on a fact-finding mission to see if the conditions are what they say they are to the American government. They go, they come back, it's successful. Washington in this time is basically trying to keep the U.S. on the agenda, keep Liberia on the U.S. agenda. He's constantly in communication with Liberian officials during this 5-year period, and ultimately a deal is cut. They try to do it like in a completely official way. So it comes before the Senate, and it's actually not approved. And then Washington, when the deal is not approved, he is clued in on the fact that the deal isn't approved, and he communicates this to Liberian officials. At the same time, he tells the Liberian officials what he believes the alternative deal would be, which he has proposed to Taft, and Taft privately extends the deal to Liberia, which is a multinational loan to buy Liberia out of the debt. And this is a proposal that basically happens, as we can tell through the correspondence between Taft and Washington. And it is the alternative to the on-the-table deal, which would have required approval from the Senate and the House to lend or to buy Liberia out of said debt, which would stop encroachment on French, British, and German colonial forces on the ground. So he carries this case in particular is a case of endurance. He is able to keep Liberia on the agenda. He is engaged in some heavy negotiations and maneuvering behind the scenes. And what develops is a model for how the African population here can influence U.S. policy on Africa. And so these are the things that come out of this case. One, as an African person who is leadership here, the model that we can see with Washington is this. He has two different conversations happening with U.S. officials and with the Liberian officials. He has a very inside conversation going on with Liberian officials, and it is very clear that his loyalty is to Liberia and Liberian officials. He goes on many occasions to say, and this is documented in the book through his correspondence, that no one, not even the native Liberian, is more interested in the state of Liberia than he is what he writes. Taft, at one point, is so perplexed by Washington's over-identification, in his opinion, with Africa and African people and Liberians in particular. He says to him, you can help Liberia as an American, which you are, not as a Liberian, which you are not. So he's threatened by Washington's commitment and identification with Liberia, but that's reasonably so that Washington identifies, because Liberia and American Liberians are the result of a desire by African people to leave and return to Africa. So there's an intrinsic motivation and tie there between Washington and Liberia. However, Washington is truly a Pan-Africanist for this reason. Many people have said to me about this case, oh, well, Liberia was a mess, and the thing with American Liberians. Yes, but Washington's recommendations to Liberians are as follows. One, he says to Liberian officials, the death of Liberia, the fate of Liberia will be destroyed if you do not resolve the Americo-Liberian and indigenous Liberian issue. And the indigenous Liberian has a legitimate grievance against the Americo-Liberian. He states that Washington is not in favor of something that we would call African-American nationalism, which is what Americo-Liberians engage in on the ground. He warns against this, and he warns against this rift because he understands this rift between the two groups would be the death of Liberia. And so he encourages Liberian officials to resolve the Americo-Liberian and indigenous Liberian problem. He is not so committed to Americo-Liberians that he is not committed to Liberia and Africans as a whole. You understand? So his main issue with Liberia has been the practices and the behavior of this Americo-Liberian population that's settled in the country. His second recommendation to Liberian officials privately, and this is outside of the realm of his conversation with American U.S. officials. These are his private conversations through correspondence with Liberian officials on the ground, some of which were members of this commission that came to Tuskegee in the U.S. His other recommendation was that Liberians must stop consuming Western goods. Because he's all about nation-building practices. So he told them, every time Liberians open a can, you feel the fate of Liberians in poverty, because you pay taxes on those cans to bring that into the country. He breaks down the whole process, production process and consumption process, and explains that in order for Liberia to be independent and free, it needs to stop consuming Western goods. It's very clear about that. And finally, he recommends that Liberia build industrial and vocational institutions. And clearly the recommendation is not to solely build those institutions, because his own institution is an institution for teachers that can teach both trades, any given trade. And generally the goal was to be a teacher who could teach two trades, right? So he makes those recommendations to Liberia privately, and has a very inside conversation with Liberian officials regarding Liberia and how to navigate their relations as facilitated by him with the United States government. And we have to do that. We're here in the United States. We have to influence how the United States engages African people internationally. And we need to influence the government in a positive way in terms of doing that, right? Fight. He's willing to fight in this instance, and he does. Now, he has a very different conversation with the U.S. government. He presses them. He lobbies for Liberia in terms of getting support, and he's able to bring the whole situation full circle. Now, the downside of this, what Washington was trying to do was ensure the survival of Liberia. Any one of the three European colonial forces on the ground felt like they had economic right to Liberia for whatever reason. They were looking to annex it because they were intolerant of an independent African nation on the continent in that region. If the U.S. wasn't going to take it, they felt like they had a right to. Washington's goal was to preserve Liberia as a nation, to give it a chance to exist, to give it a chance to see what African people in Liberia will be able to do. And those were both African people who had previously been enslaved here and African people who had never been displaced on the continent. And he is invested in that way. So he's able to bring that case full circle. And that one is more of an endurance, a test of endurance. In the years that he's engaged in the Liberian Commission, there's a lot of other things going on in terms of his involvement in Africa in general. And so he's, someone who's like, he's getting crash course in many instances and applying much of what he's learning in real time also, because that case is 5 years, the Liberian crisis. So ultimately, Liberia accepts a deal, a multinational loan, which is a deal that gets them out of debt, but the trade-off is this. The U.S. negotiates that they can actually put a military base close to or in Liberia. They don't go right to doing it, but that is one of the deals cut in that deal. And the U.S. also negotiates to put a rubber plantation there in Liberia. See, the U.S., the reason why they don't jump on Liberia is because they hadn't quite figured out how they could exploit the economy. So they're unwilling to stake claims on Liberia because they don't want to invest in Liberia. But they figured this out shortly after this whole case and crisis. And so hence Firestone in the country. So there are some deals that are not too appealing, that are part of this larger deal or negotiation. They're not the best deal, but it wasn't the best deal. But what it did was allow Liberia to survive, to, in essence, fight another day, right, as opposed to be annexed immediately by any one of those, colonial forces on the ground. And Washington was the key negotiator in that. I think his recommendations were correct, but he did what the most he could do, right? Which was to preserve and protect Liberia at that time. And it took that 5-year negotiation window in order to secure that for Liberia. Later on, after Washington is deceased, there is a school that goes up in Liberia that is a model of Tuskegee and is supposed to be an industrial school. That happens, it's conceptualized while Washington is still alive because he sees it as a bond between the African population in the U.S. or Tuskegee and Africans in Liberia. But it doesn't come to fruition until after his death. And there are many other replicas of Tuskegee on the African continent, actually. So that's the Liberia case.
Okay, appreciate, sister. Everyone, you're listening to Black Intelligence Say, and we're talking about Booker T. Washington in Africa, the making of a Pan-Africanist. If you would like to call in now and participate in the Q&A, the phone number is 312-985-7856. I have the picture up here. So, but before we take Q&A, though, I would like for you to let them know where they can order the book, the website,
Okay.
and
Yeah.
and how they can get in contact. Also, how they can get in contact with you if they want to, sell the book out of their bookstores and things of that nature. So, you have the floor.
Okay. Well, they can definitely order the book at Booker T. Washington and Africa.com. That's the book website. So that's Booker T. Washington and Africa.com. It's all one word, no abbreviation or anything. Just Booker T. Washington and Africa.com. Or you can Google Booker T. Washington, the making of a Pan-Africanist, and it should pop up there in the first couple of hits. And you can buy the book on there. The book was on Amazon, but the book did very well this fall. And so it came out earlier last year, but it did very well this fall. So I sold out on Amazon pretty quick. That's probably going to go, back up, I guess, within the month because we'll have, books with Amazon. But those are sold out for now. So the website is the main book they can get it from. And how can they hit me up? I mean, you can actually email me at dr.tyrene.wright@gmail. And so you can hit me up and ask me questions about the book or ask me where I'll be in terms of talk. The website, in the past, we used to put all of that stuff up, but now, things are actually moving sort of fast. So it sometimes changes, and I can't put them up as quickly as possible. So in the future, you will be able to look on the website and see the under the tab for events. You'll be able to see where I'm going to be, speaking at or doing a talk or a lecture on the book. On the 23rd of this month, January, I'll be at an event for CMOTAP, Committee Against the Negative Images of African People. I will be on a panel on Washington and Du Bois, talking about the book, but debating that issue. We like to do great debates up here in New York. And so that's going to be on the 23rd. But then I have another event coming up, and you'll have to go on the website and see. I have a lot of events for February, but January, that's one of the major events where I'll be dealing with the topic that deals with the book. And then February, I mostly have book talks and lectures that are exclusively about the book, not, debating anyone.
So let me ask you this, sister. Have you made a Facebook, professional page for this?
No, I haven't. I'm about to, because what is going to happen in the next couple of days is that the book will also be on all the platforms, meaning iBook, Kindle, which is Amazon, and some other platforms, so you'll be able to download the book digitally and otherwise on your book or any of the digital platforms. So I haven't made a page, but I probably, basically what's going to happen is a relaunch of the book, because only the soft cover is out. So the hardcover will be coming out next month along with all the digital forms of the book. So at that point in time, maybe I'll make a Facebook page for it.
Yeah, most definitely. And then I would like to ask one more question before we open it up for Q&A. Are you working on another one of this sort, or, you know, a sequel?
Well, you know, it's so funny because there are some things that I really wanted to go back to and really kind of flesh out even more. This book is a relatively short book that is very packed full of information. And I really wrote the book in lay language. It's not in very academic language. It's accessible language because I want the person who knows about Washington in the American context and narrative to be able to consume this and also understand his role on the international level and relationship to Africa and African people on the continent and throughout the diaspora. So there our chapter expand because the debate on the floor of the House of Representatives in New York is ferocious. Not in New York, but in D.C. But there is a ferocious debate about this measure, this African exclusion measure. And you get to hear U.S. representatives on every side from every territory in the U.S. Divulge their position on the immigration of African people to this country. I mean, it's both things you suspect and things you never expect, you know. And I want to go back and flesh out that conversation. You get that debate in this book to a degree. You get some of the highlights of it, but I'm really a hardcore primary source kind of sister. I don't do it, almost no secondary sources, which is the way it should be, of course. But the primary documents, so in other words, basically I went to the congressional record so I could see the whole conversation on the floor of the House and the floor of the Senate, right, when the measure was proposed and passed, and as it goes to the House. But some of the things that are missing from this book was, how a white representative from the North talks about the African population. And it gives a great indication of what this is all about. This white representative who is arguing against the measure discusses the fact that in 1915, these African people who had been enslaved for over 250 years had walked out of enslavement and in 50 years achieved what no one could imagine that anybody would achieve. And he recognized that the story of the African person in this country, survivor of that 250 years of the worst form of enslavement on the earth, and onslaught after that, with only 12 years of support out of enslavement under radical Reconstruction, had accomplished what no other group of people in this world had ever accomplished in such a short amount of time. The story is phenomenal and epic, and we need to talk about it as such. But the problem is that we're largely uneducated about what we did in those 12 years after enslavement. And we are raging out of enslavement, meaning we come out of enslavement flying in terms of progress, building institutions, and functioning in independent industrial communities that were sustainable, all to the chagrin of the masses of white people in this country who felt that if they are progressing this fast, what will they do in 30 years, in 40 years, in 50 years. And all of that progress is put down by white violence and terrorism in this country. And so most of what we did is lost in terms of our collective history and our memory. And we need to bring that back because we were kicking ass in this country. And so those are some of the things that we don't know about, we don't see. You know, it's rare that you hear us talk about our own story in that way, right? As the brilliant people that we are, both now and historically. But we can't talk about it because it's been burnt and, you know,
yes.
buried.
Somebody please mute your mic. Please mute your mics, everyone, until she finished. Then we're going to open up for Q&A. Go ahead, sister.
Right. So essentially, those are some of the things I would love to return to when I expand the book. And I will expand the book, but this is kind of a culmination of many years of research on Washington. And so I had to get this book out of the way so I can move on to some other projects. And eventually I will come back and expand even more on it because I am aware of the fact that there are about, I've heard 1,000 boxes, but it could be more or less, of unedited papers from Washington's personal papers. And I might take a stab at editing that. If there is this level and wealth of information in the edited papers, there is, of course, that much more in the unedited papers, because these edited papers obviously aren't immune to bias, right? There's some bias. Lewis Harlan was the editor of these papers. So while it is Washington's correspondence, and I'm a Tuskegean, I'm an alumni, so I've had exceptional access to archives and information, first-hand information outside of the archives directly from people who are Tuskegeans. One of my professors who was an advisor to me was a professor who came to Tuskegee when Carver was still there. And when I was a student at Tuskegee, he was in his 70s. Fast forward 20 years later, he taught at Tuskegee until he was 91 and passed away the following year at 92. And his name was Professor Frank Tolan. And so he always, as I did this research, he always would encourage me, because I would always, you know, as I'm uncovering information that is not so popular, I would always say, is this correct? Am I reading this right? Like, because, you know, so much of this is not in the public realm. And in working with the papers, you have to uncover various personalities. Who is this person writing here? What are they talking about? You have to figure out all of this information. And there's a, you know, scientific and methodical way to do that, but it is very tedious work. So as you are, you know, like doing a puzzle, right?
Correct.
Historical research. And so you're digging and digging and digging. And, you know, at this point in time, I'm more than a decade into doing this work on Washington, so nothing really phases me. I don't really take people's response to their lack of knowledge of the information personally. I know that there's a reason, and we can get into that later, but there's a reason why this information is not in the public realm. So, you know, and that has to do with the monopoly by white scholars and intellectuals.
Okay, so let's open it up for Q&A. We got a lot of people here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to call out some phone numbers and keep a little order here so we won't get bombarded with a lot of noise and stuff. And then we can kind of open it up. Y'all know how to do it here as long as we respect the mic. So first I'm going to start off with Sci-Fi, since he called in. Peace, brother. How you doing? You can open up your phone lines and ask a question or make a statement if you like, sir.
Hey, hello. How you doing, Carl? And how are you doing, Doctor?
Peace.
Hi.
I run the page on Facebook, kind of Water and African. So, you know, we often is excited to hear about people speaking on this subject. And I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit about the interaction between or the involvement of the Niagara movement along with Booker T, and like if you had any comments about that interaction between those two groups in reference to like some of the undermining that they is up to, or do you not focus much on that?
Okay. Well, thank you for asking that question. So let me say this, you know, because a lot of people, I always have to make this clear. As soon as I talk about Washington, you know, most people do want me to talk about Du Bois and his interaction with the talented 10. And the truth is this. I am an expert on Washington's role in Africa and with African people. Now, clearly I have knowledge of certain things in American history and have a, you know, like I said, I wrote this book, but I'm also a Tuskegee alumni. So I have some general knowledge that I acquired probably as a student there. And then also I have exposure to the American narrative. This book and my work really doesn't focus on Washington's American context. The only time I deal with his American context is when I have to contextualize that for what he is doing internationally, right? So, example, in order to understand something like the Togo expedition and how Washington and Tuskegeans get involved in that, I have to explain what is happening in the U.S. agriculturally, politically, and otherwise. So it leads me to conversations about the Cotton State Atlanta Exposition speech, which is known as the Atlanta Compromise, and things like that. I get into those things only to explain how Washington ends up being involved in Togo, and that speech had everything to do with it. But I generally, my expertise is on Washington and Africa, the stuff that is not known by general American society or part of the American narrative. Now, that being said, it's my personal opinion as a researcher, but this is supported by the evidence that I've seen. Washington, and I'm just going to focus on Du Bois because he had relationships with the others, but he primarily dealt with Du Bois. This list is primarily with Du Bois, and then of course people like Trotter and others. But I will say this: the evidence in my book shows that this rift, these issues between Washington and something like the Niagara movement, which you understand quickly fizzled, right? But Washington, the Niagara movement, and Du Bois, for Washington, it did not go that deep, to be quite honest. You can see correspondence at the end of his life where he is talking about Du Bois and others. And he is in a space where he is perplexed but he is not preoccupied or consumed by the existence or position of Du Bois or any of the others. He argues on many occasions that people who create a platform off of opposing him generally lose their platform eventually. Now, we know that doesn't happen with Du Bois, but if you know Du Bois largely feels like he is forgotten after Washington dies. He writes that later on in his final years. So to answer your question, I never focused on a lot of what happened between Washington and Du Bois. However, I do plan on writing something about that just to quench the appetite and the thirst of people, I might produce an article that gets into the direct correspondence between the two men. And just in the same way, if you were listening from the beginning of the program, I actually read some of the first letters between Du Bois and Washington in the court, because, you know, people always say, oh, that's not true. Listen, it's right there for your, you know, I did the research, I did the tedious work, but this is not limited to me. This information is salient. This information is also free to the public. If you go to a library and pull the, you know, get the collection and read it. And so, you know, I merely address what's salient, you know, regarding Washington. But I might do that in the future, focus on, do something independent on Washington and Du Bois and their, you know, correspondence.
Well, there's been abundance of information you've told so far, so I definitely look forward to getting your book, and I appreciate you just for taking time out to, you know, kind of focus in on this moment in history.
Thank you. Thank you for calling.
Okay.
Order the book.
Okay, I'm gonna go to 206 now. So 206, if you have a statement or a question, you can open up your phone line and speak with the doctor.
I mean, really, man, I'll just keep engaged, just listening to the good doctor, and so I appreciate the information. As I told you earlier, and so I'm not all that familiar with see other than just, you know, just that she was, you know, someone who lived with substance control and all that. I didn't really know about his affiliation and you know, his influence in the Liberia situation, which to me is important.
Albert, can you repeat what the caller said? Because I can't hear him too clear.
I don't know. If you could speak up a little bit, this Dizzle, right?
Yes, sir.
I just speak up a little bit or get closer to your phone. We really couldn't make out what you were saying.
All right, let me start it like this. I'm in my car. Can you hear me better now?
Great.
Yeah, much better.
Okay, well, first I want to say peace to Israel Doctrine. I want to say to the good doctor, I appreciate this dialogue you guys are having, educating people on the importance of Booker T. Washington. The thing that interests me the most that I was unaware of is the connection with Liberia and the formula of Liberia. So, I mean, you know, I was kind of in and out of the show a little bit, so if you can touch on that a little bit more, and also where we can get your book, I'd appreciate that. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and mute, because I am a traffic traveler, so I'm going to go ahead and mute from there.
Okay.
Okay. So I talked about the Liberian crisis, and basically with a 5-year case, and Washington was the key negotiator on behalf of Liberia. And he brings the commission to the U.S., orchestrates and hosts the secret meetings between the Liberian Commission and the U.S. officials. He also is part of, but does not travel with, the Liberian Commission to the U.S. Commission to Liberia, which is a fact-finding mission. And he protects the negotiations until there is a deal that's cut that is viable, but not the best deal, right? The deal that's cut is a multinational loan, which buys Liberia out of debt and stops the threat of French, British, and German encroachment on the nation by those colonial forces on the ground in Africa. Washington, you know, in this case, some people have, like, you know, I've seen various things on the internet where people are critiquing or discussing what they might agree with or not agree with about the book, but the misconception is that Washington is aligned with American Liberians because he's involved and engaged in African American nationalism of some sort, right? Which we know is pronounced amongst Americo-Liberians. Americo-Liberians go to Liberia and institutionalize a system of discriminatory practices against the indigenous African population. Washington is not aligned with this, and that's important to understand. He sharply criticizes this, and that is very important to understand about his posture in relationship to Liberia. So he brings this negotiations to fruition and full circle. He gives his own recommendations to Liberia, which are to stop importing Western goods and consuming Western goods, because it ensures Liberia will be in poverty because they are not producing industry and they are consuming. And to be quite frank with you, that recommendation is relevant for every African nation on earth right now, on the continent, in the Caribbean, in Central and South America. You know, places that produce raw goods and then turn around and import Western, you know, canned goods, refined goods back into their country after they, you know, ship out raw goods, right? It keeps nations in a cycle of poverty. Washington was very aware of this, and he recommends against this to Liberian officials. He also, you know, obviously addresses the Americo-Liberian and the indigenous Liberian or African conflict and sees it as something that will destroy the nation if it is not resolved, and recognizes that the native Liberians has a very legitimate grievance with the Americo-Liberian. And let me just say this. I really, in the book, I really, you know, beat the drum on issues like this, because I think it's very real for us to consider expatriation. But we have to be very careful about our posture on the continent. I'm someone who's lived on the continent, had a brief opportunity to teach at a university in West Africa, one of the best, University of Sheikh Anta Diop. However, you know, I can see how it is very problematic for African people from the diaspora to go to the continent and know how to act and what posture we should have, okay? And to get this ridiculous thought out of our head that because we were enslaved in America, somehow we are better, and that is evidence of, you know, African American nationalism. And this case is a perfect example of how someone should talk to continental Africans who are in a position of power, running and building a nation and trying to secure a nation, and how we should talk to them, what our posture should be with respect for trying to advocate for African nations within the United States, meaning what is the posture of the African person in the United States when negotiating on behalf of African nations on the continent? How should we pressure and influence U.S. policy with regard to African nations on the continent of Africa? It's important that we stay in that, but it's important that we have the proper posture as African people who are coming from the U.S. and understand that our alliances are on the ground in Africa, and we need to be in solidarity with that. So we don't trade off, you know, African American nationalism. Put it this way, we don't assert African American nationalism when we go to Africa, right? We cannot do that because there's such a problem in it. With what is going on in America, we should not be perpetuating that. And you know, clearly that's a fact that we are not better because we are enslaved, right? Or because we were enslaved. We claim victory over that enslavement and are trying to determine our destinies by returning to Africa. But that is not the basis upon which we go there and we oppress another group of people who are in fact African as well. And Washington was very critical of that. And so that's important to understand about the Liberian crisis. Now, I don't, you know, my work as a researcher is very straightforward, meaning this. I do interpretive work on the actual historical facts, but I don't skew anything because my work is a work that is committed to African people. So when Washington does something wrong, I say that. When he does something right, I say that too. Okay? And so the Liberian case is really a very good model in terms of African leadership in the United States and how we should deal with diplomatically African nations, African leadership, and problems on the African continent that may have arose from our own presence and settlement on the continent. So it is a wonderful model for that. And Washington's endurance in terms of his commitment to Liberia, right? He stays the course, and he's relentless. He is going to cut some deal because for him, it is unacceptable to imagine that there is not going to be at least these two independent African nations on the continent of Africa, right? And if he can have something to do with keeping Liberia independent and free, he's going to go to the limit, and he does.
Okay.
Oh, you can get the book. I'm sorry. You can get the book on the website, Booker T. Washington and Africa.com. Don't be afraid. Just write that out with no abbreviation. So BOOKERTANDAFRICA.com. It's long. Maybe we'll change it to BTW in Africa or something like that. I don't know, but you can order the book. You have it in a week. It also is up on Amazon, but I'm pretty sure we're still sold out. I'll know. You'll be able to order it on there next week, but right now I'm sure it's still sold out. I'm pretty sure.
If you don't mind, if I can make one more quick comment, Israel.
Yes.
Well, first of all, I noticed earlier you mentioned when you're speaking on Booker T. Washington and Pan-Africanism, something that I think it's important maybe to state again, because as you were saying, you know, especially at that point in time, the concept of Pan-Africanism was pretty new, like in an embryonic stage. So when a lot of people criticize some of the decisions he made or steps he took or didn't take, we got to remember that this is like a process that was just beginning. So we have the hindsight to look back now and say certain things. So I wanted to highlight that. And then I wanted to say, as far as Liberia goes, because, you know, a lot of us talk about repatriation, and we speak of Ghana, we speak of Nigeria, Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, and whatnot, but we don't speak of Liberia. And seeing that that was a state or a country that was formed by former slaves or whatnot, I would think that that should be a place that we should consider. And I know there's probably some unique challenges there, so maybe if you do have time real quick just to highlight some of those challenges and maybe what we can do to kind of, because like from my studies, you know, when our forefathers went there to repatriate, there was kind of a rift between the natives because of our white supremacist attitude that we took towards our people there that kind of isolated us.
Yeah. Right.
So I'm just wondering what current challenges there are that maybe, and how we can maybe approach that, and what are the, you know, would it be effective and necessary in your opinion to repatriate or to repatriate specifically there in some cases? Then I'll go back and mute and listen to your response.
I wouldn't, for expatriation, I wouldn't really recommend Liberia personally. I mean, I wouldn't expatriate to Liberia. I'm definitely the expatriation type and have done that once, and I'm going to do it again. However, I would say look at more progressive African nations, and I guess progressive can be relative, and so I would say look at places like Zimbabwe, and that's just from what I'm hearing in and around my circle and my research that I'm doing, because I'm always exploring things like that. But as far as, you know, Liberia is concerned, you know, today, present day Liberia, we have to be very realistic about what's happened in Liberia. Liberia, from its inception, has always been basically undermined. Because that Americo-Liberian population, you know, created basically a black elite, right? A particular class of people who held the majority of the power. And, produced regime after regime pretty much. Most of the leadership in Liberia comes from the Americo-Liberian population. And then we understand the relationship the Americo-Liberian population has had with the power establishment here in the United States. So it's hard to actually say, go to Liberia, primarily because Liberia still, as a result of the wars, especially the last, civil war, has had such issues economically and otherwise. We have to take, as far as African people in the United States are concerned, we have to take serious responsibility for what happened in Liberia. And that's a conversation for us to actually have, between African people in the diaspora and on the continent, particularly African so-called Americans who go there as Americo-Liberians and Africans on the continent in Liberia, because these situations that I talk about in that chapter have everything to do with the civil wars and the abuse of power and by the Americo-Liberian population. So there's things for us to atone for there. Particularly, it's definitely it is definitely a course in how to manage, deal with, negotiate our relationship with our brothers and sisters on the continent. But I would not say that, that's someplace we need to go back and try to recreate or whatever. I think that there are other Ghana. I think we should still be trying Ghana. The right of abode is something that hasn't been fully realized by any African expat from the U.S. But there's still hope. I think, Zimbabwe is prime for expatriation. There is a nice relationship between African people in this country who support Zimbabwe and understand what Zimbabwe is trying to do and the Zimbabwean government. So I think, that's a country to look at in terms of expatriation. Some of the best real estate on earth, and politically, they have the right posture in relationship to the Western world, to be quite honest. It's only African countries standing in open resistance to white supremacy on the continent of Africa. This idea that, Zimbabwe should not be for Zimbabweans and that the land should not belong to Zimbabweans. They are fighting those struggles to fully reclaim the nation and, benefit from their land. So I think that that's a country. But we have to remember this. No matter what country on the African continent you end up in, our attitude and our posture has to be that we go there and we live in peace, and that we don't assert this American brand of nationalism and discriminatory practices that we experience here. We go and try to institutionalize that on any level. We have to understand that we plan just in the same way that some people thought it was a good idea to integrate here, although this country has never really been integrated. Then take that energy and go to Africa with it. Be prepared to integrate on the continent. Be prepared to re-engage the best of African values, right? On the continent. And so, we need to really critique our posture, because I will tell you this one thing. I am well traveled on the African continent, and I see a nice number of African expats, playing Western games on the continent, okay? As I told a friend of mine, I'm not white when I go to Africa. I'm still an African, and I don't play those games. I'm not a white girl in Africa, and I said that primarily because I've observed that kind of behavior by people we know, are black, but go to Africa and play white. Well, no, my business and my politics on the continent is the same as it is everywhere I go. I'm an African person, and I think that that's what we need to remember first. that our business and our politics need to be consistent and compatible and have integrity, and we should relate to Africans on the continent accordingly.
Okay. We got 832. 832. You can open your mic and speak if you got any questions or statement.
Yeah, how you doing? This is Sharp Spear. How you doing, Dr. Wright?
Oh, well, how are you? Good to hear your voice.
All right. Can you, if you can you speak on, I know you kind of gave a small illustration of how the information that Booker T. Washington was teaching at Tuskegee. Can you kind of like speak to how he actually connected that with the common people? You know, his intimate relationship with the common people and how they were able to, you know, translate that information to them so that, you know, we see this progress being made over, you know, several generations economically and land and all the other scenarios.
So your question is, how was Washington communicating with the mass about what basically the values should be and practices should be?
Yeah, like how you kind of gave an illustration how they took information at Tuskegee and then they, you know, transferred it to the common people, you know, whether it was dressmaking or, you know, whatever, just that intimate, like in the book Builder of a Civilization by Emmett Scott. He talks about this intimate relationship Booker T had with the common people and how the common people, you know, supported him even in defiance to their pastors at the church who didn't like Booker T. Mm.
Right. Well, I mean, what I do cover that, but the way I cover it is this: he is, you know, on an institutional level, what he is attempting to do is, one, I mean, listen, I hate to say it, and people will have a problem with me saying this, but the concept doesn't originate with Thomas Dixon. But Thomas Dixon, as you and I both know, we had a conversation about this. Thomas Dixon calls Washington out in terms of what the practices are at Tuskegee and how, you know, these are the dangerous aspects of Tuskegee. What Washington is seeking to do is implement these nation management and nation building practices, right? He offers the average person, the common man, a method through which to elevate himself, but really his goal is this. And this is all in chapter 3, the institutional breakdown of what was happening, how the school is designed programmatically, the curriculum, the practices, the mission and the beliefs. You know, there's a lot of images. There are a lot of images in that chapter of the different industries and so on and so forth. But his concept, and you can see this primarily with the agricultural model, his concept was that if you could feed yourself and you could control all that you consume, that you could be fully and completely independent. His belief was also that the Black community, and he doesn't say this explicitly in these words, but he says it in general on many, many levels, on many occasions. His concept was that we have to stop engaging in producing just war goods, right? We have to know how to, you know, present and sell the whole thing, meaning finished product. His idea was that Black people, in particular African people in America, should dominate and monopolize a certain set of industries. So whatever that was, whether that was shoemaking, right, or brick making, because there, you know, during this time, there also becomes, you know, Tuskegee red clay, Tuskegee bricks, you know. So if you go up and down the east coast of the United States, there are a lot of buildings that were erected with Tuskegee bricks because represent a certain type of brick that they manufactured and created in Tuskegee, which came from the Alabama red clay. But his concept was simply that, you know, if you could control your destiny, meet all your own needs, you could control your life and your existence. And in terms of a literal program, he felt as though there were industries that we ought to corner, perfect, and monopolize. Okay? He was a shrewd believer in that. And so much of what's going on with Washington is this. My interpretation in respect to his personal papers, it is very clear that the man was engaging in separatist practices. Okay? He was not an integrationist. Okay? Tuskegee is a separatist model. Make no mistake about that. And there are scholars who long before me discussed it, but didn't really have, for lack of a better description, the bravado to have these public conversations about Washington because of the way he's cast in larger American society. But Manning Marable knew that Washington was a separatist. He writes a very important article called Booker T. Washington and African Nationalism, where he lists Washington's relationships with various African nationalists on the continent. But more importantly, in this article, he points out Washington and Tuskegee's avowed support for Black nationalists. Okay? And that comes from Manning Marable having looked at and read the correspondence Washington has with various Black nationalists, and even back to Africa. Advocates and proponents of Back to Africa movement like Henry McTeal, Bishop Turner, okay, and others. But his idea was simply to buckle down, hone in, build your own community, and it's not about being a complex person, but about controlling your own destiny by providing for yourself on every level. Right, which is part of the reason with, why that phrase comes about, leave your underwear at home, we make our own at Tuskegee. Because, the concept is that there's power in being able to feed oneself. Now, the things he does go through to provide that for Tuskegeans and are unusual lengths, so it's very interesting. But I don't know if I answered your question, but conceptually that's where it's going. And so he appeals more, although it's a teaching institution, he appeals more to the working class person, right? Mm-hmm. Who is trying to not just survive, but establish oneself and establish some measure of independence for oneself. Part of the Tuskegee philosophy is independence through industry. Emmett J. Scott at one time wrote an article about Tuskegee, and it's called Tuskegee and its People. And Emmett J. Scott, as you might know, was Washington's executive secretary. And in this article he wrote called Tuskegee and its People, he wrote that the philosophy of Tuskegee was that there can be no liberty without intelligence, no independence without industry, and no power for man and charm for woman without character. And that was pretty much his philosophy as he espoused it to the students and faculty at Tuskegee, that he felt, there was more than just learning going on. There was a sacred mission for us to essentially be independent and sustainable. But let me just say this. There's something else. There was another person, a non-Black person, who noticed what was going on at Tuskegee, and he wasn't as diabolical as Thomas Dixon. And he was a journalist out of Chicago, and he wrote in the Chicago Record Herald about Tuskegee, and it was called Working Out the Race Problem. And he documents what he observed about Tuskegee and says this. He says, a school, Tuskegee is not a school in the ordinary sense of the word. It's a city in itself, a community that dominates a whole county. It's a great industrial plant with 40 trades and industries that consumes all its own products, that erects its own buildings, first by making its own bricks, that grows its own food, makes its own clothes, writes and prints its own textbooks, all by the way of education. And so there were people around the country who noticed what Tuskegee was. It wasn't simply a school, more an industrial model that put in practice, nation building practices that, were suitable for African communities. And Washington is very serious about that. Okay, having a steady flow of African students from the continent of Africa, but also, African students from the diaspora, and all with the objective to return to their own communities and build, right? That was part of it. The students who were born in the U.S. were not off the hook with that part of the mission, right? They too were pressured and impressed to go back to their communities and put these practices in the works, and not just simply, go back and, rejoin society. But there was a mission at hand for Tuskegeeans. How did I answer your question?
You did.
Okay.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
We got a 713 on the line also. If you would like to ask any questions or make a statement, you could open your phone line now. And
Hello?
713.
I guess they're gone.
Nah, they still here. Unless they fell asleep or something. But
Okay.
586, how you doing, sisters?
Hey, peace, brother. Hey, peace, sister. How you doing?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm okay. I see you back again.
Thank you. Do we know each other?
You was on last time.
Nah. This her first time on.
Oh, okay. Well, there was the other sister on then.
Yeah, this not the same sister.
Huh?
Not the same sister.
Oh, okay. Oh, wow. This sounds just alike. I stepped in. Well, that's okay. I see you was talking about that Booker T. Washington. You know, when I looked at the Twitter type to my Booker T. Washington, and I went and pulled up the history book, the Black History book, and I looked and I said, people never talk about the Black History book and what went on in the history book. And I told Brother Israel I was going to go and pull up and read a little bit about the book. And I heard him talk about the school, but when he addressed, he did some kind of dress, and Governor Bullard, he said he rushed across the stage and shook his hand. What did he address? Do you know?
I'm not sure. Okay, one, I'm not hearing you too clearly, but two, can you repeat that part again? What address was it?
I think she's talking about the Atlanta Compromise when he got through with that. The Governor Bullock.
When he rushed across the stage and shook his hand.
Mm-hmm.
What did he address for the college head?
What do I think of that, or what do I think that?
No, I'm talking about what was the day he addressed? What speech did he do?
I think you're talking about the Cotton State Exposition speech, which people refer to as the Atlanta Compromise.
Oh, okay.
Are you referring to that? Okay. I think so.
Okay. It doesn't say. It doesn't say. It just say he was telling somebody after he left the Tuskegee, after he left the Tuskegee, he had constructed a sawmill, and over in the next paragraph, he was telling them he said when Dr. Washington finished his address, he later recalled Governor Bullock rushed across the stage and shook his hand. I'm like, I wonder what was that all about when he run across the stage again, because in this right here, in these books, it just got so much of what happened then. If I go back to some more pages, I read about Frederick Douglass, and Booker T. Washington, and this man named, you ever heard of Joseph C. Price?
What is his name? Justin C. Parks?
Yeah, Joseph C. Price.
No, I don't. I'm not familiar.
Well, let me say this. Let me say this. You probably need to get her book, sister, so you can get some history that's, you know, not watered down or coming to the people out there.
Now, that's written by an African person. I don't know if that's written by an African person, but
no, it's important. He was with Booker T. Washington at the Negro Leader and Orator. That's what it said in his history. I'm looking in the history book. I'm just on saying when I'm reading, because I never heard these people either until I went in here and was reading about him. I'm reading what I know about Booker T. Washington because my daughter had to do a report on him because he went to Harvard. He went to Harvard University. He was the first Negro to receive that honor. I'm like, wow. And I tell the young people I talk to, I say, y'all need to go read some of the history that the black they have been. If these people can do it, y'all can do it just as well. That is the good book I heard you say was on Amazon. So I'm going to go look it up.
Well, right now, if you wanted to get the book, you have to get it from Booker T. Washington and Africa.com. And so you can go on that website. It's Booker T. Washington and Africa.com. No abbreviation in it. Just straight.
Yeah, I heard you.
Washington.
I'm gonna hook you up, sister, with the link and everything. Don't worry about it. You got me.
I'm not. And then wait, I heard you talking about Marcus Garvey. Now, Brother Israel was talking about that before we even got on the lesson today, and I'm like, really? Marcus Garvey? I never even heard of this man before. But you know, didn't I not hear you say that? Did Booker T. Washington die in 1916 and Marvin Garvey had just came in 1916?
No, Booker T. Washington died in November of 1915, and Garvey came forth later in March of 1916.
Right, okay. 1916. Yeah. Right, because I know this Marvin Garvey, he was talking about I wonder if people know he knows it's a black God and a black Jesus and Virgin Mary. But you know what? Y'all have inspired me to go read these 11 books I got. So, you know, I'm going to have to go get in these 11 books and read about some of the stuff. Because I've never even heard of Marcus Garvey. Never in my life. And you were talking about the white supremacy. Booker T. Washington wrote this right here. Where is it at? Let me go back right over here, because I got my, you were talking about education in Tuskegee. I'm like, wow, you know, I ain't even know nothing about no Tuskegee. And
what?
He said, and he also was talking about.
Did you have a final question?
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. That is when he said, when he was talking about the white supremacy, he said one day the blacks was going to catch up. He said that the blacks might catch up with the whites one day. What did he mean by that, the blacks going to catch up with the white one day?
Well, I don't know where that particular statement came from, but I would say that Booker T. Washington was primarily concerned with black advancement. And he was not, you know, a lot of people will refer to the instance where he's questioned about segregation and integration. And he, you know, affirms for some white people that, oh, no, he's not a separatist, right? But, you know, the reality is this. In practice, he was a separatist. Tuskegee was primarily the African population who had been enslaved and currently free at that time. It was a clear understanding that Tuskegee functioned as an industrial enclave or town. And Washington really, to a large extent, is the person who protected all of that. He understood that what he was doing could be provocative. I think this is part of the reason why he allowed this image of himself in American society. Like, you know, my expertise is really not his American dealings, but I am aware, as a consequence of studying his role in Africa, I'm aware of a lot of what he does. And there are many cases where Washington publicly will say he doesn't support something. So, for example, there was an attorney who was assaulted by some white people.
Okay.
And the attorney publicly asked for asylum, you know, in Tuskegee. And Washington said no publicly. But privately, he arranged to have this man attended to medically and moved to a safe place. And he both financed and orchestrated that. Now, clearly, what he's doing is, you know, he's saying what he needs to say in order to protect Tuskegee. There are more than a few people who noticed that one wrong move on the part of Washington could cause venomous whites who were terroristic in nature and on every side of them to wipe the entire town out in one night. There are African nationalists who come and observe this after visiting Tuskegee. There are others who observe it, you know, so it's very interesting, you know, the criticism that comes about of Washington, but he, unlike other, you know, leadership at the time, was responsible for the lives of hundreds of students. And he was not the kind of person who was going to say anything to jeopardize their lives. However, he was far more committed to the practice of nation building and building African communities that nothing would have interrupted him from doing what he was trying to do for African people. And so he does that. And if the price he had to pay, I believe, was to, you know, wear a mask, I don't think for him, someone who has survived slavery, I don't think that was anything that bothered him. Why? Because, you know, he was an institution builder. And so that's about more than just one person. That's about a people. And making a contribution to a people. And so his commitment was to us, you know. And so, I mean, it's almost like criticizing your mother for what she does out in the world to bring the food home to you. Or almost like criticizing your father for what he does out in the world for bringing the food home to you. Some fathers will go real low to bring that food home and feed their children. Some fathers, you know, got a lot of pride and they gonna be too compromised. And he might come with, you know, he might not bring as much home. So what I'm saying is that the man that Washington was, he did a lot of things in the American context to bring what he had to bring home to Tuskegee. And he does it. I just always find it interesting, the criticism that people in modern times level against them, where, you know, we have almost no concept of contribution to our people. We think that advancement, progress is advancing and progressing as our individual selves. You know, we have no real concrete concept of making a contribution to our people collectively in the way that Washington did, right? Few of us build institutions as we should. Few of us are, you know, completely unconflicted in our service to our people, even when that is a professional designation for us, you know, as a scholar or a researcher or as an activist. He was a really unbelievably unbelievably dedicated and uncompromised. You know what I'm saying?
So excuse me, sisters. We got 10 minutes to 10 o'clock my time, which is 11. Both of you all time. So, sister,
Okay.
any last words you would like to say about Booker T. Washington and your book and the show? Please take us out, and we will be closing the show down.
Okay, well, so I just want people to buy the book. I think it's a different perspective than you would be used to about Washington. And really, at the end of the day, my point and objective of writing the book was to conjure this conversation about how do African people in this day and age survive in the world, and what are we going to do, and to bring back a model of sustainability for African people. And that's my bottom line. What are we going to do? More than this book is about Africa, more than this book is about Booker T. Washington, it's about African people. And if Washington didn't do anything significant for African people, I would have nothing to say about him. It is the fact that he is able to make concrete contributions in the area of policy that, that allows me to write this book, right? He put some real concrete models out there for us to access. And then, of course, the model, the sustainable model that was Tuskegee, we need to bring that back. And let me just say the side note, the Tuskegee that I'm referring to in this book is not the Tuskegee of today, right? I'm talking about the Tuskegee of old. Tuskegee no longer functions in the way that I talk about it in my book at that time, between 1895 and 1915, right? So I'm revisiting the past, and I might say that, one of my next books will be, not the next one, my next one is going to be on women, but maybe one after that, it's on my agenda, will be about industrial Black communities. Because we've done it. We don't have to look outside ourselves for what we're going to do. We know what to do. We need to invoke those models and those methods from that period, and we need to study them and revise them slightly and apply them. We know how to build our communities. We've done it many times before, and so we need to just analyze that information and apply it. And we have the answers. Because, ultimately, nobody else is going to save us, right? African people are going to be saved by African people, both here and abroad. And so we need to look at what we've done before. We need to stop looking outside ourselves. And if this is one of, I assert this as one of those models that we must revisit if we're going to discuss how we are going to survive as African people, as human beings on this earth. Period.
Okay, with that said, that's the show, people. I appreciate you coming, sister, and informing people about Booker T in Africa and how he evolved to what we call today a Pan-Africanist. Man, I learned a lot today. I believe a lot of people will appreciate the information that you gave them today. And with that said, people, go buy the book. I will be posting the link to the book. Buy the book. Buy one for the local library. Buy one for a friend. And support the sister endeavors. With that said, I'm gonna say peace. Y'all can stay on the line, but I'm gonna cut off. I'm gonna most definitely. All right, I'm gonna most definitely cut off YouTube. So with that said, peace to the YouTubers and whoever hangs up. I'll talk with y'all tomorrow. We're gonna have B Dot on the line. He's a battle rapper. He'll be here tomorrow, and we'll be talking about his evolution as a person and a rapper. So with that said, peace and good night to y'all.
Everybody have a blessed night.
Thank you. Good night.
Okay.
All right, peace.